The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the defeat of the Danish army at the Battle of Edington in 878. This video, read in the West Saxon dialect of Old English, describes those events as they are recorded in the Chronicle. A note in this particular translation here, W will be represented by the double U, the U doubled next to each other, and that'll represent the letter W. Okay, and the source I'm using for the Chronicle here, for the translation version that'll be read, it can be found at this link here, which will be included in the description below the video. All right, so the Great Heathen Army arrives in 865 via Kent and East Anglia. Over a number of years, it campaigns, destroying the Anglian kingdoms of Mercia, Northumbria, and then East Anglia, before finally turning on the Saxons in the kingdom of Wessex, or the West Saxons. And this video is the final in this series, and this deals with the last year, the year 878, where King Alfred finally defeats the Viking army. He finally defeats the Battle of Edington, the Great Heathen Army, made up largely of Danish Vikings, but also of others from Norway, Sweden, and further afield even. All right, shield walls facing each other to give you some sense of what it must have been like at that time to opposing armies. A few thousand on either side, forming a shield wall. In those days, fighting with spear, sword, and axe, and knives, and forming a shield wall where the shields interlocked with each other, and the ranks were several ranks deep, and they advanced on each other, pushing and forcing and hoping to create a break in the shield wall of the opposing side. This was, for the Anglo-Saxons, a very difficult time, a very desperate time. The survival of the Anglo-Saxon people in the British Isles was really in doubt here. At one point, the last kingdom, the kingdom of Wessex, was overrun, and the Vikings were in possession of all of the lands of the Anglo-Saxons. And it looked like the idea of an England would never be born. The idea of an England begins with King Alfred and comes eventually, over time, is eventually fulfilled by his grandson, Athelstan, in which all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms are united. Up until this time, the kingdoms have been separate. You had the kingdom of Mercia, the kingdom of Northumbria, the kingdom of the East Angles, the kingdom of Kent to some degree by this time, and this is the late 9th century. And the other kingdom, of course, is Wessex, the West Saxons. Eventually, they would merge and become one kingdom, the Kingdom of England, under King Alfred's son, Athelstan. But at this point now, in 878, at one point, the last surviving Anglo-Saxon kingdom, or the kingdom of the Saxons, had been overwhelmed. And King Alfred had been forced to flee and to hide in the marshes in Somerset, and to wage a guerrilla war for some months before he could return with an army and take on the Vikings and finally defeat them and secure a peace, which would give him time to develop the kingdom of Wessex and eventually to gain control of Mercia through his son, and then eventually Northumbria and so on, finally completed the unification of all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to form the Kingdom of England, which had been King Alfred's dream. So it was a desperate year. After many years of defeats and failure, this was it. It was everything. It was win or lose completely. Winner takes all. There would have been no England born had King Alfred not succeeded. So it's quite an amazing story. All right, so I'm using the Parker Chronicle. It's the oldest chronicle. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles were begun under King Alfred in the latter part of his reign, the oldest being the Parker manuscript. And the particular reading I'm going to use here is this one, and it can be found at this link here, which is included in the description below the video. But just before we do that, before we go into the reading, we just have a look here. So the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle A, the earliest surviving copy, is now at the Cambridge Corpus Christi College, manuscript number 173. Contains entries written at different times between the 9th and early 11th centuries with a 12th century continuation. Sometimes known as the Parker Chronicle, after Matthew Parker, Archbishop of Canterbury, who gave large parts of his collection of manuscripts to the University of Cambridge, and so on. And the Parker Library is named after him. So these are the original writings of the scribes of that era. And let's just have a look. You can look at these online following that link there. If you looked it up on Google, you'll be able to follow that link, and you can see the original manuscripts. This is the oldest of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. And you can see it looks like this. Now, if you just look up here, you can see the D there, and then the triple C. I'm just picking this one. The D is 500. Each C is 100, so you have 3 of them, so that's 800. There's actually an L there, that's 50, so you have 850. An X is 10, so you have 860. And then the V is a 5, so you have 865. And that's the year that the Viking army arrived. And you can see it's mentioning here, here, in this year that is. And then you mention here you have Canterbury. Okay. So that's 865 when the Viking army first arrives, and we've seen that in the earlier video in this series, the very first video in this series, if you look that up. And then you come down here and you have D triple C, so that's 800. L is 50, 850. X is 10, so 860, and then a V, that's 865, and then a single 1 there, letter I. All right, so you have 866. So the second year the Vikings are here. And if we keep going down here, okay, you can see, let's just go a little bit further. We have down here 870. So here's 870, 871. Let's just keep going to this page. So 871, bit of a longer reading there. And this is the original Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This goes back to the 9th to 11th century. Okay, and we keep going here, and a little bit faint here, and then finally this one down here. Now, if I just go back a bit, this one down here is the start, D, 500, sorry, 3 C's, that's 300, so 800, 50, and then I've got an X, 860, another X, 870, a 5, it's very hard to see, sorry about that, it is very faint, a 5 there, and then I have 3 others, which makes an 8, so I have 878, and that's the final year. And that's the subject of the reading of this video. So we have the year 878, and that is the original Anglo-Saxon version here, written in Old English by King Alfred's scribes, and that contains the content of this video, what happened in the year 878, and it carries on over here, right down to here. Okay, so let's go. 878 AD. Her hiener besatal, say her on midna winter over, 12 nicht, to Chippenhammer. And ihr don West Saxon land, and ihr Seton, and Mitchell das Volkes over sa adoravdon. And thus also rest on a mastan dal, here Yoridon, and him to Yachir don Buton tham Kuninga Alfred. and he lutle werde the liche after woodum for, and on more fastenum, and thas ilkan winter was inwares borulsur and helftenes, on West Saxon, on Devonshire, mid Thareon 20 shippem, and hierne monthar ofseloch, and echte hund monne mit him, and fewer 10 monne. His heres, and thas on Toron warchte Alfred Kuning, lutle werde jewerk at Athelinge je. And of tham jewerke was winnende with thonne her, and sumor satna sadal. Seithar nichts was, tha on thar seovothan weakan over tron hejerad to edgeburuch testane. Beestan sel wudda, and him to kom monthar onien sumor sata alla, and will saten, and hamtun shir sedal, se hier behinen sa was, and his jefaien waren, and he for ane nicht, of tham wichan to ielea, and thas ane to edanduna, and thar je vecht with alne thonne herre, and hiene je fleende, and him after rad of that je werk, and thar sat. Fewer tiene nicht, and thar salda se here him for Jeslas, and Michla Arthus, that here off his riche woldon. And him je heten that here Kuning fulwichte on von walde, and here that je laston sawa, and thas thare weakan kom se Kuning to him godorum, thariety sum thar monethe in tham here where thuste waren at alre, and that is with Athelinge je, and his se Kuning thar onfeng at fulwichte, and his charism leasing was at Wedmar, and he was 12 nicht mit tham Kuninge, and he hinne Michlum, and his jeferen mit fewer thude. And image of battle there, colour image, some sense of the carnage and the carry on. Seizing the enemy's standard there, taking possession of the battlefield. And again, close in fighting, you can see axe, sword, spear, shields. Gives you some sense of battle at that time, including the use of knife or seax. Well, this is a sword actually here, but you can see all manner of weapons at work. Okay, and here's part of the peace deal with Guthrum, was that he and his leading noblemen were baptized as part of the agreement, and King Alfred stood as sponsor for their baptism. And that's what this image is trying to show. So the heathens, if you like, were converted as part of the peace settlement, and they were given a section. The former kingdom of Mercia and Northumbria was under the Danelaw, so the country was split and became what's known as the Danelaw, and Guthrum administered it until his death. And he remained a Christian. He didn't take up and attack Alfred again. An artist's impression of the late Saxon Winchester, which is King Alfred's capital. So an impression of what Winchester might have looked like in that time, in the late Saxon era. You can see the walled city there, built by King Alfred to protect the city, as he did in other places too. After the defeat of the Vikings, he embarked on a series of defensive walled city building across the land so that people could, in the event of a Viking attack, retreat inside the walls and take refuge until the Vikings had passed and until reinforcements could come and deal with the attacking Vikings. All right, and the statue of King Alfred today in Winchester. And while this video series has dealt with the Great Heathen Army and the war that went on from 865 until 878, King Alfred after that embarked upon a program of learning and education and nation building. And eventually the Kingdom of England would come into existence under his grandson, Athelstan, all because of his efforts. But at one point, everything was lost. For a number of months, none of the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom had been defeated. It looked like the end of any concept of England or Anglo-Saxon homeland. The Angles and the Saxons have been totally defeated. And then somehow from nowhere, he brings his people back and overcomes the conquering Viking army and destroys it and makes a peace with it, with its survivors. Quite an incredible story. If it wasn't part of actual history, it'd be very hard to believe. And that's the end there.